Hi all. So I'm here today with Kevin Vallier of Bowling Green State University. You were the first interview that we ever recorded for this channel, Kevin,
Ah,
back last year now, I guess. We
hmm
talked
hmm
about liberalism, polarization, social trust. Here today, talking about Kevin's new book, All the Kingdoms in the World, which is
Oh,
yes,
that's
there.
reversed.
Um, and it's about integralism, very critical of integralism, a political philosophy that I guess used to be very popular, is not so popular now, but has been making a comeback among certain circles, including certain legal circles, that sort of stuff. And that, to my mind at least, is potentially quite dangerous. And we'll be talking about some of that stuff as well. So Kevin, I guess first of all, just tell us what is integralism?
So I take integralism to be a kind of political ideal that specifies the nature of the political good and the source of the authority of the state. And it has to meet three conditions. So the first condition is that God authorizes a nation state in order to pursue the common good of its members, an acceptable, reasonable claim. The second one is that God has authorized the church to pursue the supernatural spiritual good of its baptized members. Now, also, I think would be good to have a footnote now that it's also permitted to preach the gospel to non-believers. And then the final condition, which is the controversial one, and it says, owing to the state's nobler or the church's nobler purpose, the church can actually authorize the state to use the state civil code to back up the church's spiritual agenda. So, for instance, one case common in the High Middle Ages was that someone would be judged a heretic by the church. They'd be excommunicated. If they were not punished in enough time or they didn't repent, rather, then the state could be authorized or directed in order to apply civil punishments to the heretic, which usually, if they were a big heretic by the 14th century, 13th, 12th, it was death by fire. But you don't have to have anything like that kind of extreme view of punishments to be an integralist. There's a huge amount of variation. What makes a regime integralist really chiefly is this indirect sovereignty condition, the indirect sovereignty of the church over the state, which in the early modern period was often called the indirect power of the Pope by figures like Salamancans, like Vittoria and Suarez, and then, of course, the main theorist of the indirect power, not a Salamancan, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who's a big authority here because he's a saint and a doctor of the Catholic Church. So really, it's these three conditions: God authorizing the sort of nation state to pursue the natural common good, the church to pursue the supernatural common good, and then the church's partial sovereignty over the state. But it's that sovereignty condition that makes integralism unique.
Yeah. The first one is just kind of an account of where the state's political authority derives from that, some people accept, some won't.
Yeah,
But the second one, again, a theological claim that,
yeah,
you know, probably most Christians will accept or, will
yeah,
be sympathetic to. Then the third one, this idea that the state is subordinate to the
yeah,
church in such a way that the church can kind of tell it what to do, including potentially telling it to punish people who violate rules that the church wants to set up, that sort of thing.
yeah,
Yeah. So an integralist regime, it won't be theocratic in like the narrow sense of,
yeah,
it's not like the actual leader of the state is a bishop or whatever.
yeah,
But there are civil authorities, but they are subordinate to the church. They have
yeah,
maybe room to do some things on their own, within their own discretion, but they
yeah.
ultimately have to take orders from the church if
Yes, although the church really can't overstep its bounds.
yeah,
So it can't take over agricultural policy just because people
right,
need to
right.
eat to go to mass. The state really does have a God-given agenda, and integralism needs. I mean, this was always a problem practically for the regimes that appeared integralist because there's boundary disputes, jurisdictional disputes between Pope and Crown. Um, So yeah.
Yeah, so the state is subordinate to the church with respect to things that the church has jurisdiction over, these spiritual matters.
Precisely.
And yes,
Yes.
yes,
Yes.
yeah. And you've given some examples from historical Catholicism. Does integralism exist in other traditions?
So this is pretty interesting. There, I think, is a form of Anglican integralism, except that it's not really an integralist because a secular ruler is the head of the church.
Right, right.
There are integralisty things where the crown is supposed to respect the deliverances, say, of the bishops or Archbishop of Canterbury or what have you. So like has certain resemblance. And then there's the Caesar Papist or Symphonia models in the Eastern, among the Eastern Orthodox, but those in some ways are closer to Anglicanism because the emperor or the czar is seen as having a great deal of ecclesiastical authority in terms of the appointment of bishops and patriarchs, just not messing with dogma. It was really that integralism arose under the unique circumstances of Latin Christendom, which was you had the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The church could expand into that state capacity, provide legal services, healthcare services, but this large state decayed into lots of tiny states. To this very weird situation where an ecclesiastical power existed, was well organized, and had a lot more power than local political units. So similar things. It's actually pretty rare, as I understand it, in like the history of religious and political institutions, for there to be this vast asymmetry. Many religions don't have their own distinctive ecclesiastical organization at all. Hinduism doesn't have that. Islam doesn't really have that. And so, you had, because in the East, the empire didn't fall until 1453. It was tiny by then. But the point was, one of the other things that happened in the East was that, the apostles founded churches, but almost all of them were in the Eastern Empire. And so there was one in the Western Empire, which was Rome, and it was a super church because it had Paul and Peter both there. So in the West, you have lots of small political authorities and one big religious authority. And in the East, you have lots of smallish religious authorities and one great big political authority. And this is what kind of happens with Henry VIII as well, although where the king is just way more powerful than the bishops. So actually, integralism's pretty confined. And I tend to use the term more narrowly. I don't want to use it, for instance, for the view that the king has supreme power to appoint bishops. This is one of the things that the Catholic Church fought tooth and nail for in the medieval period. It was a huge deal in the 11th century, like one of the most important political events, the investiture contest. So, but there is a kind of rationale, which is that, well, look, I mean, the church is dealing with more important things. Maybe that means it should have more power in a certain sense. But yeah, it's pretty confined. I mean, I'd even say now, once you get powerful Catholic confessional states and they can ignore the Pope, that starts to undermine any constitutional relationship of the indirect power, such that the regimes that were functionally integralists are pretty small in number, very unlike modern social conditions. And it's not always clear whether the Pope can actually say depose a king. They try, and most of the times they fail. And so, it is hard to even know whether a truly stable integralist regime has ever existed. You could look at 13th century France, but once you get past St. Louis, I mean, the French monarch is like, no, I'm gonna appoint my own bishops. So it's interesting once you think about the structure of an integralist regime. Historically, the range of regimes really is pretty narrow. I mean, you've got 11th, 12th century, 13th century kind of Latin Christendom, 14th century too, and then you get to the Reformation in the form of these strong monarchs, and things get even dicier.
That sort of leads into my next question. So some people watching will think, okay, that's all interesting. I'm glad that we don't do that stuff anymore. But like, why do we need a book about this? Isn't this sort of a dead letter? Like, this is a
Mhm.
historical anomaly. As you said, it wasn't even consistently implemented very often back in the day.
Mhm. Yeah.
Obviously the US government is not about to subordinate itself to the Pope. And we have all kinds of weapons and stuff if the Pope tries. So
Yeah.
why should we be interested in this?
Well, I think there's a couple of different reasons. The first is the reason the British integralists started talking about it at all. And they meant it as a completely church-facing project and no political ambitions. The thought was that the church had become too liberal, in part because it has forgotten itself as a spiritual polity. And so it stopped holding people responsible, its members responsible for sin. And integralism was a way of recovering the church's self-understanding as a polity, which many of the British integralists think is essential for stopping the death of the Catholic Church in Western Europe. Um, so for them, it's really all about the church coming to understand itself as it once did in order to improve the health of the church. Now, I actually agree with them that, like, yeah, I mean, it's important. Any association has to hold people responsible for violating its rules if it wants to flourish. I mean, of course. The problem is that they went further and said, oh, yeah, well, there's also the state being involved. But then an American monk who was a Cistercian in Austria, Father Evan Waldstein, around 10 years ago, through social media, brought it over to the US. And there were a group of integralists, left and right leaning on economic issues. And they weren't clearly, like, some were political, some weren't. But by the time 2016 rolls around and you've got a well-known journalist, Sohrab Ahmari, who converts, and you've got a Harvard law professor, Adrian Vermeule, who converts. And then they start to turn things political, although the people internally that were turning it political, it was already a disagreement. And then Trump won. And over time, the next couple of years, the right-wing integralists became extremely political, completely focused on politics, and the left-wing integralists kind of died out, so that integralism became a movement on the new right. Now, why do they matter if they're so small? There's two reasons. The first is that, for better or worse, Catholic intellectuals have a gigantic effect, especially on the right, in terms of people's thinking. It's actually long been the case because, Buckley, William F. Buckley was Catholic, National Review. You've got a lot of attempts where, the direction that Catholic thought goes can have important downstream effects. Not that we'll ever establish integralism, but that we may have small moves in that direction that, say, erode democratic protections or protections for basic rights. And in particular, the integralists were kind of the first people to try to normalize the sort of culture war tactics of Viktor Orban in Hungary. And a lot of them are saying, look, the state needs to be used in the culture war. And I think that idea has been influential. So that's one reason it has importance. Another reason it has an importance is because there's a lot of people so disaffected from American political order that it's, the sense among Catholics and many Christians is that the regime is so corrupt that we need to start looking at radical alternatives. And I think in time that's going to affect how they behave. And so this disaffection with liberal order is changing conservative movement, because you have younger conservatives, they don't care about the Constitution that much. They're not going to have a pocket Constitution walking around like 30 years ago. It's a very different kind of culture and scenario. In fact, even at Notre Dame, these ideas are becoming pretty widespread among undergraduates and also the law school. So that's not going to make integralism happen, but it is going to change somewhat eventually the federal judiciary.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Yeah. One reason that the influence among intellectuals is of outsized importance is because these are often legal academics.
Yes.
Judges can have a very big impact on law, on policy, et cetera, even without democratic support. The way that the US system is set up. That's right. And what exactly what is the concrete political program of these? Like what are they aiming for in concrete terms?
They tend to be extremely cagey. and hard to pin down in terms of their policy programs. And many of them will be like, well, we don't know. One of them is just like 200 proof Catholic social thought. So in terms of policy, like Chad Pecknold proposed that pro-life policy be conducted by executive order. They've proposed banning all pornography, to reinstate blasphemy laws, to reinstate blue laws. They ultimately want the 14th Amendment to recognize the personhood of the fetus, and so it would be instantly banned in every single state in the country. So many of their stuff is about like kind of like bypassing the democratic process, and that's important. So they sort of say, look, what really matters is the common good. What matters less are these kind of procedures that kind of only imperfectly arrive at it. So we've got to kind of be more direct. They used to talk on Twitter maybe 4 or 5 years ago. They'd be pretty open, like, well, we'd force Protestants to go to mass, and probably a monarch is going to be better. Like you could just Google their tweets because people have made records, and you could see like much more extreme things that they were advocating for. So they were tipping their hand more before, but as it became more influential, they backed off of saying all the things that they were for. So my view is they do like a lot of sectarian groups do when they become more influential, and it's to tamp down on their radicalism, particularly full expression of their position. So
yeah, I've had the same thought, because sometimes you read them and the examples of policies you get are things like, oh, we'd have paid family leave.
yes,
And it's like, well, that sounds good to me, but like there are much easier ways to get that than implementing an integrate. So they're like
yeah,
the what they're aiming for has to be more than that.
that's right. That's right. No, that's right. And all of your followers, I mean, pretty much know this. And so you don't see many people saying, oh, we don't have that goal at all. Um, they just, because I think what they're trying to do is build a movement, but remain in the public eye at the same time. So I think there's kind of some of it's been taken esoteric, which I think is very interesting in itself. So yeah, I mean, among philosophers that discuss this, closer to your generation, who's good bit younger than I am, but not a crazy amount. There's been, more discussion, and there are some pretty like robustly Catholic analytic philosophers that seem to find it attractive, but not that many. But there's far more than there were 10 years ago. So yeah, it matters for Christian philosophers to some extent, but it's really only confined to Catholics and really to a pretty narrow version of them. Many of the Catholics are, sufficiently politically progressive, democratic, influenced by 20th century church teaching, that they just think all of this is dumb. But in the earlier generation of Catholics, like Paul Weitzman or something, or Eleanor Stump, they're completely horrified and think this is bizarre. But it's really Catholic philosophers under 30 or so.
Yeah.
Where you see this.
Yeah. There are lots of people in my generation on both sides who are disillusioned with the existing order, and that creates openness to much more radical alternatives. So what exactly I mean, some of the things you said are basically attempts to pursue conservative policies through maybe undemocratic means.
Yes.
Others, blasphemy laws, establishing a monarchy. Those are totally outside of the Overton window. Things that even probably the vast majority of conservatives right now would not support, even apart from any procedural questions. So what is the actual like transitional theory or theory of change? I mean, how do they
So until a week or two ago, no one had challenged my attempt to reconstruct the transitional thing. So I have had a debate with Ed Fazer about this recently, but before 2 weeks ago, I was 100% confident, and now I'm more like 95% confident. that the plan, particularly as articulated by Adrian Buell, goes something like this. He's Fred, I'm working from about 12 essays or so, or short essays that he's written in various publications. And the first, and many of these steps are steps that any radical group would need to take. Like, it's not crazy to attribute it and then to see it in the writings explicitly. So the first is, look, you form a close-knit community of people that kind of understand the truth. This is actually what explains a lot of their Twitter behavior. For instance, they're the most prolific blockers of any political movement I know of. And it's ultimately not because they're annoyed with people outside, or they're trying to maintain, this is my theory, they're trying to maintain high status within the internal sect. But it's like manifest that they have a digital community, they're trying to expand it with conferences and so on. It's whatever. Marxists do this, libertarians do this, whatever. Like, that's not everybody, like tons of people, radical groups do this. The next step is a little more sophisticated, but it is still common, which is that most of these radical groups are thinking in terms of, well, we got to try to win elections or ally with people to win elections. Libertarians have spent a lot of time with that. Marxists had a lot of success doing that in a number of countries. Just taking my two other radical groups. One of the curious things about the integralists is that they're pretty explicit, and Vermeulen is too. He has a piece on political strategy based on Pope Leo XIII's encouragement that French Catholics participate in the Third Republic, called Relevance. And he says, look, I have a different version of Relevance. It involves influencing executive and judicial institutions rather than parliamentary methods. Just explicit. Boom. Right there. So the second, and the citations are in the book, but they're also on my Substack. So yeah, you want to staff the relevant groups. Now, there's an element also in common with Marxism, but other radical groups as well, which is a belief that history will deliver political victory, hopefully entirely non-violently, which is their theory about why liberalism will collapse, because they're very convinced that it will. They've got a couple of different stories, but here's one way that it goes. It has to do with portraying liberals as a really large group of elites and a really small group of the public, and paints liberals as including American conservatives, and also has a very unclear social ontology. Like, it's not clear what liberalism is. They don't use any analysis of how it works ideologically. But however they want to understand it, liberals are ascetic fanatics, that they are devoted to liberation. They started off with some reasonable liberations, like first wave feminism or ending slavery, although they never say anything positive about feminism. But you start with these kind of like big, like reasonable liberations, but liberals don't stop. As I say in the book, like for the integralists, liberals are always hungry. In the same way that, say, Marx says this about capitalism. So what Marx says is one of the things that makes the bourgeoisie so unstable is they're so desperate for profit, but they already pursued, the easy, low-hanging fruit for profit. And so they're pursuing the smaller and smaller margins of profit until they just become completely rabid and nuts, and that's part of their collapse. But Vermeulen thinks that something like this is going to happen with liberals. They'll keep trying weirder and weirder liberations, in part because part of their own religious self-understanding is that they're liberating the populace, right? That's like sort of narrow and bigoted. So he sees like the LGBT movement on that, this transgender movement, transgender rights movement in those terms, is just getting to like more and more absurd, but lower and lower return liberations. And he just thinks they have to run out of it eventually. And so liberalism will discredit itself. Not unlike the way Marxism discredited itself. I'm not saying Vermeulen is a Marxist at all. Plenty of people have the view that history will do the dirty work for them. I mean, like Vermeulen, in terms of tactics, I've never seen him advocate anything remotely violent. Indeed, when he describes the strategies, he describes them as like really morally scrupulous. So he has this piece on a Christian strategy where He says, look, I mean, Catholic leaders have to have the highest degree of moral excellence. So what you've got the group of people that kind of get what's going on. They gradually get positions of power. Liberalism destroys itself. All of that's very clear. And then what happens? Well, my theory is this. Look, if liberalism dies and you have a bunch of people that staff the state that aren't liberals, then they take over the state. There's nothing weird about thinking that's true. I mean, just think about 1991 and the Soviet Union, right? Like, you've got a bunch of people that favor democracy there. They're a minority. Marxism discredited itself. The regime collapses, but the state doesn't. Russia doesn't become an anarchy, right? And then the Democrats move in and they start producing democratic and market-friendly reforms. Sometimes the ideology of states just collapses. And so the thought that, yeah, you go for it, right? And I think there's a bunch of also stuff, pieces that indicate that is precisely the idea. There has been some debate about this where some people say, well, the state capture thing is like so far in the future, it's not part of any broader goal. I think, based on my own study of these folks, that I don't believe it for 1 second, because of how focused they are on political change, and non-democratic political change. The right people need to be in the right place at the right time in case liberalism falls pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. It might take centuries, but it might not. And one of the things I say in the book is, like, one dilemma for this transition plan is, if it's a short run plan, it's going to involve, unintentionally, but it's going to involve a huge amount of violence that, in order to suppress pluralism and liberalism, in order to suppress liberals, and make progress, in particular, because liberals are going to resist. And if the liberals are like what the integralists say, liberals will resist with total violence and bloodshed. So the question is what the integralists can do to defend themselves, and that's not been spelled out.
Yeah.
However, if the transition plan is over centuries, and I mean, it's not a good plan, right? Because it doesn't really give you any. So you might just say, oh, well, they're thinking about centuries of change, so there's no plan. Except there's so many strategic writings, including stuff called A Christian Strategy, that I think do strongly suggest this. But also, I think there's just flat out evidence that these strategic pieces are ways of reaching integralism, because people within the organization explicitly have said these are Catholic integralist plans. Again, I lay all of this out. Not all of it in the book, but yeah. So the transition plan works like this. And again, put whatever radical ideology you want into it. Okay. You form the small group of people that get it. It's a scholarly community. It's a moral community. Okay. You put people in positions of power, maybe democratically, maybe not. Okay. You have a theory about the state dying in some way, right? Okay. That's common. And then you think, look, if people are in the right place at the right time, they should go in. So that's what I think is going on the state side. That has a lot of problems. I mean, either it's so distant where using reason and persuasion is going to just, like, you have no idea, like zero idea what's going to happen, or it's so short term that you've got to do stuff that Saver-Mule says that Catholics should never do. So either they're in a moral dilemma, which is that they can't reach their political goals without violating their faith, or their ideal doesn't really do any work or of interest in terms of what they advocate. Then that's like, well, why even be an integralist, right? It's like maybe for theological reasons or something, but it becomes uninteresting as a movement.
Yeah.
But then the stuff they don't talk about at all is stuff that it's just entailed by what they want, which is they have to convert the church. Right, that's just entailed by their view, right? They have to get the church to be integralist again. And this is the part where I say this is the part that's super weird, right? Because there's 5,600 Catholic bishops all around the world, and they have not one bishop openly on their side, right? And they've got a global church with 1 billion members. The bishops are drawn from the priests, who are drawn from the population. You have to ultimately get enough bishops to become cardinals that are integralist, that they will even think of electing an integralist pope. And even if they try, they could fail. And even if they succeed, the pope might not do what they want. And even if the pope wanted to change policy, there'd be all these practical reasons not to do it, right? Particularly because Catholics in vulnerable countries, if the pope says, oh, yeah, I'm trying to claim subordination over states, I mean, that's going to be a really good reason to go after Catholic citizens. And we know that from Catholic history. States would just be like, oh, you're political subversives. Like we can't tolerate you. I'm saying that well into the 20th century. So, the steps that you would need. And then there's the last step, which is to establish the indirect power. Why would any modern state obey the Vatican? There's no reason, right? And what's more is these societies that transition from will almost certainly be democratic. This is important because the Catholic Church has tried to depose kings hundreds of years ago. They've never tried to depose a prime minister, as far as I know. And that's because it's a bigger deal, right? Because you know that a lot of people support the prime minister. With a king, maybe they're hated, right? The people won't rise up. But if you try to fool with a democracy, this is why the church pulls back and just does political advocacy based on natural law these days and over the last century, or they try to work for certain confessional privileges, like Catholic privileges. So mild privileges, say mid-century Ireland and Quebec, which are democracies, and then more extreme preferences that you get under Salazar in Portugal and Franco in Spain, and those are fascist regimes. So it's some kind of preference in the law or something, but it is so far away from the ideal. You've got three basic parts, right? You've got to capture a state at some point, right? You've got to convert the church eventually, right? And then you have to reunite them eventually, right? And this is why I say that people like Vermeulen have to solve three of the greatest coordination problems in the history of the human race. But anyway, yeah. So so readers know there's been some kind of argument about this stuff, but I think I'm on really good grounds, and I've reviewed it, reviewed the citations in the book, reviewed my Substack. But I think that's what's ultimately going on now. Just to reiterate, all radical groups have some kind of plan like this that I know of, right? Like it's not you try to create positions of political power, you do your theory of history, and then you go for it, right? The big and interesting difference is, as opposed to Marxists and even libertarians, they're less democratic in terms of their strategy. And I mean, I find that striking, but that's a consistent pattern across the American integrals, which is you bypass the democratic process. You try to change things directly through the judiciary, the administrative state. That's obvious, clean on the page.
This leads a bit into something else I was going to say. So you establish your vanguard party or whatever. You establish your clique of elites who are going to push this. You get them into positions of power. You wait for liberalism, which is maybe ill-defined, but somehow or other, that's the dominant ideology. You wait for it to collapse. I had actually, what you said about their theory of liberalism's collapse reminds me about, I was at a breakfast at the Notre Dame Law School once with a Polish politician, a member of Law and Justice, who told me something very similar to that, and quoted Catherine the Great: "Equality is a monster; it can never be satisfied." This was part of his diagnosis of why. I mean the way they talk about history, and the way they describe liberals as essentially moral fanatics, it's just not clear why the fanatics aren't going to just be the horrible, right? That was going to lead into my question, which was, okay, so when liberalism collapses and you have your people stalking civil service and the judiciary or whatever, and they seize power, and then they say, okay, we're going to have a king, we're going to have blasphemy laws. Are they expecting to be greeted as liberators? Like, what? What?
This is something I talk about. I mean, it turns out that state capture is just really hard to do with big states because there's a lot of people. There's a lot of bureaus and they have different cultures. And one of the things they haven't talked about at all, because it would seem the wackiest thing, is converting the military.
Hmm.
Because what often happens when an ideological group attempts state captures, the military just comes in and establishes
Yeah.
a dictatorship. That's like all over the 20th century. It's like it's all over the place. Right? It happens in Islam. It happens in the communist movements with a fascist leader. Yeah, so you imagine, okay, you convert health and human services, right? And then you got to go over to the IRS, right? That's going to be critical. Each of those involves somehow using some kind of soft power to subdue tens of thousands. And the executive branch alone has millions of employees. And yeah, so when you try to think through this, um, it, yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't work. Now,
Yeah.
here's why that matters for the ideal. In the debates in political philosophy and ideal theory, one of the things that people think ideals are good for is to kind of give you a standard or a measure that will be action guiding in the sense of telling you how to get there. So, I mean, I think you get this with Rawls's idea of a well-ordered society. Like, I mean, you do have certain standards of justice. They're embedded in institutions with a hopefully somewhat plausible moral psychology. And then you can sort of imagine in a pretty clear way, like how you would go about approaching it, right? In terms, particularly for Rawls, in terms of economic policy that would take us pretty far away from the welfare state, right? Because that his stuff on like basic liberal liberties, that's pretty much there, right? You just have to make sure it applies to everyone, but that's not like a weird, huge change. Right. Like the big change would be going to property owning democracy or to liberal socialism. Right. But it's not hard to kind of envision the steps and how and different principles and evaluative standard. Right. Like it's okay, well, you got to satisfy this principle. Here are policies that would do more or less good, and tons of people have written about that. And whether it's public, need socialized medicine to satisfy the difference, which are all the stuff. So, or Nozick, take Nozick. I mean, it's a pretty radical idea, but okay, you privatize this, you privatize that, you privatize this, you privatize that. It's still going to create problems, but there are still half measures, things that people have tried. Right. But the way I put on integralism, my view is it's basically choice. I mean, it's essentially what Catholics can do is they can just take their conception of natural law and just push for local improvements. Like this ideal is so distant, so strange that it doesn't end up doing much work. Now, I actually think that's true of other ideals as well, that most of the work is done by the underlying moral principles, and the ideal isn't necessary or helpful. And in fact, it becomes intellectual and political baggage, unless you really are a radical, right? So yeah, you can get the family policy and the abortion banning and all that stuff from natural reason. At least that's the claim. But yeah, so one disadvantage of the integralist ideal is I think it lacks a certain kind of action guidance. But that's not the biggest problem with ideals. The other problem is like they don't work in themselves, and that's the bigger part of my critique. Is like, look, okay, well, so the point of the transition chapter is like all these young Catholic conservatives is just to say, look, if you're conservative at all, this is not for you, right? So then you start to say, okay, well, there are people who say to me, well, we don't know how to get there. One even said to me, I trust God that we'll get there. And they don't care about the transitional considerations because they've got these intuitions of people even like G.A. Cohen and stuff. So it's like you have, the ideal's the ideal and getting there doesn't matter. Now, my view is that, look, okay, you could still call an ideal an ideal. It's important because it's like it describes the political best. So that's totally fine as a kind of inquiry. There's some good things about trying to do that. So then the question is like, what's wrong with the ideal? And here, I develop a stability argument of the form that you see in Rawls's arguments against himself between a theory of justice and political liberalism. and also Nozick's story about how the minimal state arises without rights violations. And here, for both Nozick and Rawls, there are at least some facts about human nature that shape whether these things will work out, right? And they have different accounts, I think, but nonetheless, there's some underlying theory of the person. Well, guess what Catholic integralists love to talk about? Their philosophical anthropology, which is just their theory of the person and human nature and all this stuff. So what happens is the integralists will make predictions about social life based on their philosophical anthropology. Right. And they'll also say the ideal helps us to see. If we don't have it, things will happen. So Thomas Pink, he's a fabulous philosopher and a philosophical historian. But one of the things he predicts is he says, look, knowledge of the natural law is more fragile than people like Robbie George think. You can't just kind of just see it, because sin can occlude our knowledge of the natural law. It doesn't just hurt our ability to follow it. It hurts our ability to know it. And so part of the rationale for integralism is so that the church can grace the state in order to stymie that decay process. But Pink says, look, I mean, even if you start with a pure natural law state, sin is going to cause a problem. So the reason you need the church is to stymie that tendency towards instability. It's also critical that a lot of the young integralists, I think, don't understand like the background commitments of natural law theory very well. Like it would be super weird and just not coherent to say, well, it's natural law, but it doesn't matter if it motivates anybody. It doesn't matter if it structures behavior. And so the thought is you can attack a kind of natural law theory by showing that it doesn't actually coordinate human behavior or create peace. Right. So a lot of people are missing that my stability argument isn't a pragmatic argument at all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's an argument that their political theological commitments are jointly infeasible.
Yeah, so there's this question in political philosophy about how idealized the system you're defending is. There are people like G.A. Cohen who are willing to say, look, maybe what I'm saying is just not, it can't work out for beings like us, but a lot of political philosophers have thought you want your ideal system to be something that like could work in a sustainable way for beings with our natures under
and it's not a modus vivendi either. That's actually an interesting commonality with the Catholic integralists is they want most of political stability to come from people grasping and following the natural law from virtue. And this is why sometimes people say, well, the stability argument presupposes that we'll use all this coercion. It actually doesn't. The idea is you're trying to generate a model of society where you actually get stability without that much coercion. Because one of the problems that for Catholics, as opposed to Rawlsians, is that if people are insincere receivers of the sacraments, that's grave sin. Right, like it's really bad if you have too much coercion in the system, particularly. And I might have played this up even more. Like people insincerely receiving the Eucharist, like Catholics can't do that. They just can't do that. That's huge moral constraint. And so if you have a Chinese like surveillance state, you're going to have a lot of insincere religiosity. You super have to avoid it. Here's another thing curious with the Catholic integralist ideal. There's no full compliance.
I was going to say one further thing, just explicating the issue here. So we want ideally for the system to be something that could work and work for more than like 3 years or something.
That's right.
Or beings like us on a planet like this, etc.
Yes.
And in fact, the integralists want that too. And part of their criticism of other systems is that they ultimately contain the seeds of their own destruction. And, right. So it is a philosophical criticism of that ideal if integralism itself contains the seeds of its own destruction and could not be stable without huge repression that first of all ultimately is itself probably not sustainable in the long run and would also lead to things that they themselves would acknowledge as undesirable, such as people just insincerely practicing religion because the state will punish you if you're a baptized Catholic and you don't go to mass or whatever.
No. That was a huge issue actually in integralist regimes, is that a lot of people were being forced to go to mass and they didn't know what was going on. In some cases, I've read that the priest didn't know Latin. And so they are literally just like speaking gibberish. like in many medieval society and villages and stuff, like nobody was actually a Christian. They were just going through the motions and no understanding of what was happening. So
yeah. And when you say your stability argument, what is the statement of your stability argument?
The stability argument says that an integralist ideal cannot be stable for moral reasons. So that's the conclusion, because of a variety of dynamics that undermine the system that are committed to. So one of the big arguments was that the difference between and also, I'll just be clear, I don't say it's going to collapse into chaos. I say it's much more likely to collapse into what literally happened, which every quasi-integralist Catholic state that remained Catholic became a moderately establishmentarian state. They stopped doing all the integralist stuff, all of them. Okay, so it's not it will create chaos or be a dictatorship or whatever. It's that exactly what happened will happen. And here's one of the reasons, which is that in an integralist state, if you baptize your children, you give them criminal liabilities. In a moderate establishmentarian state, you don't. And I have children, and I'm a Christian, and I'd be a little worried about that. One thing I might do is say to my priest, let's do this off the books. Let's do it at the house. Let's do it at the house. And, I'm not telling you to break the law, but maybe you kind of forget that happened. So the idea is some people have said, oh, you're using full bore rational choice theory. No, I'm not. I'm absolutely not. I'm assuming at pretty large margins of cost, people will recognize it and create new practices. So one thing I think that will come up is you're just not going to get a lot, because remember, in the ideal, there's sin, right? You're just going to get a lot of people not reporting baptisms, or slightly changing baptismal rites, or, and this is super important, on Pink's interpretation of the sort of Catholic doctrine of religious freedom, you can't coerce the unbaptized. And so if there's any amount of religious minorities in these societies, you're essentially going to have the basis for asylum claims. So in Jewish communities, for instance, or Muslim communities. And also they're going to be big pluralism factories because they don't have access to grace, and that predicts decay and to the same degree. And that predicts all kinds of confusion about natural law. So unless you say society's like 100% Catholic and 100% committed, there are all of these factors that are going to stop to influence. So one is the presence of a large religious minority. Two is the presence of the relative costs of baptism versus less establishmentarian regimes. The other problem is because integralism isn't strictly dogma, there will be disagreement among elites about how often, not just for practical reasons about how much to use coercion, but principled reasons. By the time there was such a state, even under ideal conditions, you can only attribute to the states what's actually required by dogma. So the level of political disagreement is going to require gradual disenfranchisement, because the Father Martins of progressive Catholics are going to run away with things, or the Robbie George Catholics are going to run away with things. So the way I set it up is that these dynamics start to interact in ways that the Catholic integralist understanding of the person would worry them, and they can't do a lot of coercion because it raises the problems we discussed, and they can't do a small amount of coercion because then they'll just let all these things happen. So the question is there any moderate form of coercion that will produce the kind of stability that they want? And that depends on a lot of factors. One of those factors is what I call the pluralism rate, which is that, so let me back up and make a point, because there's going to be a big festering sore of pluralism in the ideal, which are the unbaptized, because that's exactly what's predicted, right? If you don't have grace, you're going to get confused more. Okay. Now, suppose the integral says, well, assume there are no religious minorities. That's a problem dialectically, and here's why. They're only able to argue that their view is stable for the right reasons if everyone is Catholic. That's a demerit of an ideal. Oh, if everyone agrees, it'll be stable. Okay. Okay, that's fine. I mean, whatever. It's not that interesting, right? So they have to show that the system can survive certain kinds of external and internal shocks. I don't say they have to avoid famine or conquest or anything silly like that. But there is a thing people are missing that I granted them, that it's actually pretty wild that I granted it to them. I didn't grant it to them in part because I couldn't model it, which is that I assume the papacy is like completely well behaved. What it does is it allows me to avoid bidirectional principal agent issues, where the Pope is trying to use the king as his extension to do policy, and the king's trying to use the Pope as an extension to do his preferred policy. And then once you throw democracy in it, you've got the agents between the prime minister and then the people. I couldn't form a model if I did that, but that happened all the time. It was just almost always not a good idea. With popes and crowns fought, as I say, like cats and dogs. So I charitably isolate for factors that I think are ruinous, because what's weird about Catholic integralism is that the papal authority is another nation as opposed to the Islamic ideal. You don't need an Islamic model of stability could just be like in a territorial unit, but you have huge principal agent problems. Because remember, in the integralist ideal, it's an ideal for a fallen world. So we can't assume that people fully comply with institutions, right? There's always going to be some sin, some corruption, or something in the system. So anyway, the stability argument is most complicated because it's the pileup of a number of dynamics. And so some people have kind of made fun of my graphs about this. For a while, that was the main criticism of the book, was that I used graphs. And the reason I did that was partly trying to depict one of the ways in which I was being charitable. So what the model says is like the state uses, so like coercions on the x-axis and commitment to integralisms on the y-axis or whatever. And I assume like the state imposes policies that will do the most good first, such that there'll be diminishing returns to more coercive policy. And eventually they'll, the costs will outweigh the benefits, right? Any integralist will say at some level of coercion, the costs outweigh the benefits. Any integralist is going to say to some, but at a certain margin, more coercion will be more effective, right? But what I granted them was in their state, the state will know which policies have the most low-hanging fruit in terms of achieving their goals. And then they will legislate in a way that is orderly with respect to the low-hanging fruit, to the high-hanging fruit. That's not good. How do they know that? Right? They don't. So one thing I want to make clear about the stability argument is just how much I'm granting to them. Because as soon as you let in this other stuff, it's just going to be a disaster. So I think it's a central issue if integralism does not uniquely order societies that allows them to keep going. Right? And I'm just drawing that out of Catholic tradition and out of integralist writings. So it's not a primarily pragmatic issue. It's that your view predicts its own unraveling, and that's bad for an ideal. So that's the next one.
Even
it's the most complex.
Yeah, even given really very favorable, unrealistically favorable assumptions. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
The bit about I think this is relevant. The bit about sort of creating a moral hazard by baptizing your children.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of when I lived in Germany, because in Germany, if you're a baptized member of certain religions, the government collects the Kirchensteuer, the church tax. They actually take about 9% of your income out and give it directly to the church. And
9%,
so
I didn't know it was that high.
Yeah, it's 8 or 9. It's 8 or 9%. It's pretty high. And so that does create a dynamic where people don't baptize their children. There actually are people who try to hunt you down if, like, you were baptized but you didn't report this correctly.
Even now, I wish I could have used that in the book. That's a great example.
Yeah, people sometimes they like churches will deny benefits to people who aren't paying the Kirchensteuer, so people will wind up paying it just so that like their kids can go to the Catholic school or whatever. So it creates all these, and to get out of it, you have to like go to a courthouse and like renounce your membership in the religion or something.
Wow.
So I fortunately I avoided it because the church that I'm part of is not one of these ones that collects the Kirchensteuer, but Yeah, that creates perverse incentives, even
Yeah.
though the stakes are way lower. Like it's not like your
Yes, that's
kid is
right.
going to be liable to criminal prosecution because
Yeah.
of not
I mean,
going to mass or whatever. But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. They change their minds about something. Suppose they find Lutheranism really
yeah,
compelling,
yeah, yeah,
or they're secretly reading Calvin's Institutes or
yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah. So I think, yeah, the stability problems are key. But the last chapter is actually the one where I think the argument is easiest to grasp.
Mhm.
And it is what I call the justice argument. And that's the claim that the ideal has inconsistent moral requirements. Everyone understands that's a problem. Everyone understands that's a problem. There's nothing about the things I say about integralist order. I actually think those are the strongest arguments,
Mhm.
objectively speaking. But the justice argument's really interesting. So I want to put it a slightly different way I put it in the book, because I think it's, given what people have said, they say, oh, it presupposes liberalism. It doesn't at all. But in part because they think I'm using theories of political obligation that are liberal, when basically none of them are. Like they almost all have pre-liberal antecedents. Like some of them go back to the Crito and the Republic. Um, and Aquinas is the one who uses a kind of consent theory in this case. So, not another, but let me put it in a way that it's internal to Catholicism. Okay. Medieval Catholicism held two things, two moral claims. Number one, it is always unjust to use religious coercion or coercion for religious ends on the unbaptized. Claim two, it is sometimes just to use religious coercion against the baptized. Okay. The modern church believes something else. They affirm the first proposition, religious coercion is always unjust when you're unbaptized, but they also accept that religious coercion is always unjust if you're baptized. Right? So if you're a Catholic, which should you hold? Right? The modern position does seem pretty consistent. The church says, look, religious liberty is grounded by the dignity of the person. It applies to everyone. That's the standard reading of Dignitatis Humanae. And there's a pretty simple moral argument for it, which is if dignity grounds religious freedom and baptism doesn't change your dignity, it grounds it after you're baptized, right? Like that's really simple, right? The church didn't always use the language of dignity in the past. And so, but the argument from in the past was that baptism served as a kind of moral transformer. It's baptism that explains what transforms religious coercion from unjust among the unbaptized to just among the baptized. And so the question is, can baptism do that? Assume everything that Catholics have always taught about baptism. It implants the supernatural virtues, forgives original sin, you left for the foams of concupiscence or whatever, but opens the door to salvation and all this stuff. So grant all of it, all of it. None of that explains why religious coercion goes from unjust to just. Now, they have some responses, and I'll go through four of them. But the first three I think are really obvious. First, Aquinas says, oh, you can do this because baptism's like a vow, right? Like if you vow to do something, you can't be forced into it, but you can be forced to keep it. The problem with his thing is it's not clear that he's trying to address the case of infant baptism.
Yeah.
And if you try, it doesn't work, because even if the person's changed by baptism, it doesn't cause a volition in the infant. The second one is a kind of gratitude theory. The thought is like, well, once you're baptized, you receive all these gifts, and that's enough for you to have political obligations. Problem is, gratitude theories are like really unpopular right now because like the way you reciprocate gratitude is thought to some way be up to you, right? So like someone does you a good turn, it's not determined by them exactly how you have to respond, right? So you might just respond by obeying the church but ignore the state, right? Like it's just gratitude theories are too I think vague in this way. Also, gratitude is often seen as best when it comes from people freely. So it being the Lord loves a cheerful giver, right? And so I think that's another weakness. But none of them like the gratitude theory at all. So the next one is the one that I think that is so deep set for them that that's where they don't feel the tug. Like they don't feel the tug at all of, well, what's the problem with forcing people to remain? And it's like, well, okay, most people think it's a huge problem. particularly like basically all Christians think it's a huge problem. But then they say, well, why should the integralists think that it's a problem? I think what's going on is that they have an extremely deep set, what we call associative theory of obligation, which is sufficient to have enforceable obligations that one is a member of the group. And
Even
so
if
as soon as you're
voluntarily join the group.
That's right. So like the associative theories of political obligation, like, look, you didn't voluntarily agree to join the state, but you still have obligations to it simply in virtue of membership, right? And then there's some marker of membership. So they say, okay, look, baptism is a marker of membership in the church. Okay, that's it. There's a couple of problems with associative theories. One problem with associative theories is it, to me, doesn't look like they're actual explanations for political obligations. Like it's more just like an assertion, like that you could question, right? Like, why does membership, like it makes sense to ask, well, why does membership create obligations to the state? But a bigger problem is that associations that you're a member doesn't entail what you're obligated to do. Right. So like there's all kinds of things there could be. Another problem is that usually we think if an organization's badly behaved, you can leave. Whereas if you're baptized, you can't undo it. Mm-hmm. The fourth problem is that it's really dialectically inert. So if you just say to other Catholics, yeah, if you're a member, you get all the integralist stuff. And then the other Catholics are like, no, if you're a member, you get all the stuff that church teaches now. But they can't say anything. All they can say is, well, it's applied by membership, right? Then they have to fall back on their dogmatic arguments, which is fine, but it's a different argument. But here's, I think, the most interesting claim, which is that, okay, maybe membership puts you under the authority of the church, but how does that apply to the state? Now, they could say, oh, well, you become a member of the state through political association, the church, through baptism, and then you're under their authority. But then so I think you have to go that route. But I actually think it's pretty interesting to say, yeah, you might be subject to the rules of the church, but like the relationship to the state is super strange and unusual, and it might not automatically commit you to that stuff. So you couldn't resist excommunication, but you would be free to resist any kind of civil punishment. Okay, so a bunch of problems with associative theory that I go through, but I think that's the one they think is so deep set that they don't even see the problem. It's like you're a member, you're subject to the rules. Okay, all right. Now there's a problem. So two more remarks on this. Okay, so sorry. Okay, so there's two more remarks that I want to make about this. The first is that integralists have all felt pressure to explain the discrepancy, at least in the eyes of others. And what's interesting is that three of the main integralist theorists all gave different theories about why forced baptism was wrong in order to explain why you could remain, be forced to remain, because that's the liberal part they have to deal with, or the pre-liberal part, right? Is that you can't force people in. So they have to come up with a moral explanation. Unless they take the fact that the jurisdictions, or unless they take the two moral facts, right? Forced baptism is wrong, forcing people to be in the church isn't wrong. Unless they take them as explanatorily basic, like there needs to be some moral story.
Right.
And they've all give different answers. The very best of them all give different answers. I don't think they have an account. Final thing. There is a subjection that Mark Murphy suggested to me that I didn't realize how much others wanted to pursue. And I want to expand on it, because you never know with a book like which objections people are going to find the most persuasive, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so here it is. We don't know why baptism places you under obligations to the church. We don't know why, but we know that it does. And if it does, and the church can authorize the state to support it, then because the church grants its authority over you to the state, you can be under the state's authority too. They call this the authorization answer to my argument. There are some real problems here. Particularly whether the church can authorize the state to use a power it doesn't have, which is to use physical coercion. So you might think, look, yeah, sure, let's grant that the church can subject you to canon law and, assign penances or whatever. But why can they authorize the state to help it when the state's implements are physical? So when I talked to John Venice about this was his, like, the church can't authorize a state to hold a power it doesn't have. And then I talked to Pink, and his response was quite surprising, even though I have a great deal of respect for Tom. He said, well, actually, historically, the church is thought to have the power to physically coerce. And then I'm just like, that's not the gospel. Like, I know that's like a really basic thing that Christians object to, but like at some point, the idea that the priests are using violence to keep people in just looks like that's not love, right? Like that, right? I mean, so I mean, if they're, so I mean, at some point you just got to be like, yeah, I mean, if the church has a native capacity to use violence, that's not sounded to me like the church. But I will expand on those things. So I go through, but ultimately coming back to the point, okay, to basically everyone in the Catholic Church itself. If you think it's wrong to religiously coerce pre-baptism, the same reasons justify it having religious liberty after baptism. Basically everybody's position now. Okay. So the integralists, I think, at least if they're going to be convincing to other Catholics, which they'd like to be, right? They have to have some account why forcing people to remain works. And if they have, what they'll do is they give some account of forcing people to remain. But the problem is then it will undermine baptism as the explanation for why people can't be coerced. So let me give you an example from what Pink said in the panel that's on my YouTube channel. He said, look, baptism starts the process of people as they grow up trusting the church as an authoritative witness to truth. But my response was, well, baptism seems neither necessary nor sufficient for that process. Because he says the church has authority when we're sensitive to the reasons that it provides. Because he thinks actually reason is like a kind of non-mechanistic efficient cause. He thinks reasons have force on the intellect. So what essentially the church is doing is it's like educating people to recognize moral truth. So it's almost like a little Razian in a kind of way. Okay, so Joseph Raz. Okay, but suppose you just grow up to believe you're baptized, and like you just grow up within the church, and everyone thinks you're baptized, right? So it's just total, like there's this totally inaccessible fact that in fact your mom accidentally, like you were baptized in the wilderness, your mom says you were baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Goo, or something like that, right? The formula doesn't go through because she doesn't say ghost, right, or spirit, right? She just trips on a word or something. The baptismal rite's invalid. It's really hard to see why that's the thing that's going to undermine people trusting the church. My thought here was that, yeah, this line that Pink gave, I think doesn't work, but he's going to be talking about it again. But, one of the others said, well, the reason you don't force people into the church is that it wrongs God, because it says that God isn't the one responsible for the process, to which my response is super simple. Like, it also wrongs the unbaptized. And so there's no explanation of that. So yeah, I think they haven't coalesced on a good explanation.
Seems you might also just think God is also responsible for keeping people in, and it's not.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Like,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a genuine puzzle for them, but that's the one they say, yeah, we got to have some kind of response to this one, because that one doesn't involve the claims about order that they think are irrelevant once there's dogmatic support for their view. It's the claim that the church's teachings are morally contradictory. They know they have to answer that one. Right. And so I'm continuing to work on that and reformulate it. And that's actually the one that people have wanted to really bandy about the most, which is fine with me, because I actually think the argument's pretty resilient to challenge.
What? So this issue reminds me a bit of, there was this big controversy a couple years ago in First Thing.
The Mortara incident.
Yes, the Mortara case. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, yes.
Integralist.
I would love to. Okay, so in the middle of the 19th century, it had been the case for several hundred years that the Pope had political domains in central Italy. And so he's ultimately the sovereign of the papal states, although there are
Mhm.
people under him that mostly focus on state-related tasks, sometimes called his vicar, the vicar. As sovereign, he has certain responsibilities, or thought he had certain responsibilities. So it's the middle of the 19th century, and Pope Pius IX, who by this time has turned pretty much against a lot of the kind of liberal orders that were arising in Europe. And there was a Jewish family that lived in the Papal States. The ghettos still existed in the middle of the 19th century. In fact, they didn't stop until the Italian Unification Forces forced them to stop in 1870. I don't think the mortara were in the ghettos, though, but I don't know for sure. And they had a Catholic nanny. And so when their child, Edgardo, was born, he'd been on the brink of death. And so it's Catholic doctrine that in emergency situations, anyone can perform a valid baptism. So the Catholic nanny baptizes him. 5 years later, Pius IX finds out. He says, I've got a duty to ensure that the child gets a Catholic education. His parents are Jewish. They're not going to do the right thing. And so he sends soldiers to take Mortara away from his family. And it starts to get really sad because they try really hard to get their kid back. They make Thomistic arguments. They're doing what they can. It also becomes a really important moment in European Jewish history because it's one of the first times that Jews across Europe all work together. It makes it sound conspiratorial. It's just out in the open where people say, look, you're mistreating Jews. Like, you can't do this. It was an international incident. And there are even cases where I think the governments of like Italy and France and Austria, some combination of them, had thought about re-kidnapping him. And Pius IX, I mean, his behavior with respect to this, I mean, I even read a book that said, like, to basically effectively anger the European diplomats, he would let Edgardo like run around and play and stuff in front of them. Like, it was not a really ugly incident. And many Europeans still remember it, and European Jews do. A lot of Americans don't know the story. And so one of the ways the integralists came to prominence is that, and this is pretty obscure history, but nonetheless, there was a book called The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara written by a historian, David Kurtzer. And Steven Spielberg wanted to make it into a movie. But he was also working on the project with Harvey Weinstein. So it got shelved. But in preparation for the movie, a copy of Edgardo's memoirs was published. And he says lots of nice stuff about Pius IX and all this kind of stuff. There's actually some evidence that was doctored. It's going to get too complicated. First Things, the kind of main Christian think mag, published a review of it by an older Dominican named Father Romanio Cesario. And he defends Pius IX, creates a gigantic firestorm. But the way the integralists respond on social media is to say, well, Pius IX was right. And people were so shocked by this, they're like, who are these people saying this crazy stuff? First Things backpedaled a little bit, but not as much as you would think. But there were a lot of people, particularly First Things Jewish readers like Yoram Hazony, that were like, this is sickening, it's outrageous. But if you follow the logic, the Catholic logic on baptism, and you're baptized, that makes you a member. You have certain rights and duties as being a member of the church. One of those is the right to Catholic education. Someone's obligated to enforce that, at least prima facie, right? Now, I think what Pius IX should have known is prima facie duty was overridden by destroying a family, right? And also for prudential reasons, for publicity nightmare. Maybe he didn't know that ahead of time or something, although yeah, I mean, the integralist position on baptism permits the morality, or saying that the Mortara kidnapping was prima facie justified. And that you might think is a reductio of the position.
Yeah.
Right. And some of the integralists on Twitter, they've just said, no, he did the right thing. And they'll go into a pretty detailed defense of the circumstances and say, look, you can even Google like integralist tweets Mortara, and they'll come up these days. So yeah, I mean, I think, it's a really, I get why they're trying to by the British ones in particular, are trying to revive some of these ideas because of these kind of church-facing goals they have. But yeah, the state-facing American integralists haven't talked about it in years, since it's because that was 2019 and they just stopped. But yeah, I mean, that kind of brought them some prominence. But yeah, you might think it's just a reductio of the position. So yeah, I mean, for listeners, so we've gone to kind of detail of my three criticisms. One is that you can't transition there. One is you can't stabilize it, and the other that it's unjust. So I have like this easy slogan with integralism: you can't get there, you can't stay there, and it's unfair. And you know, I meant it to be cheesy because it can be easy to remember. But those are the three main critiques. And until the last 2 weeks, everyone told me the transition stuff is like totally decisive, except for the people who want extreme ideal theory. The people who got through the stability chapter, which I admit is the most involved, also thought it was just a huge problem. A lot of people didn't understand the point of the models, even though I did call them a technical discussion. But that's okay, because you know, sometimes you're not as clear as you could have been. Justice arguments got a lot of play, a lot of discussion, but I have a little more work to do in trying to refine the presentation of the argument so it isn't subject to certain objections. So I'll be doing that as well. And just so people know, I mean, I try to defend integralism for the first 70 pages or so. So I say, like, here's their dogmatic case as a cumulative argument where you look at all these statements. They do add up to something. They add up to evidence that there's a case for integralism, and that it might be
Catholic theology.
Yes, only Catholic theology. Although I now realize there's actually a devastating objection to this, which is that my sources are all in Latin Christendom. And before the Great Schism, they have to count the views of all the Eastern Fathers too. And the Eastern Fathers are not integralists. So yeah, I didn't grasp that actually until a Catholic guy I know used to be Orthodox pointed it out. And I was like, oh, well, if you have to count their views, then the cumulative case argument becomes less compelling, but a lot less maybe. Although you introduce all this, the emperor is amazing stuff, which isn't great. But nonetheless, I do think there's a lot more they can say for themselves dogmatically than most Catholics think. And so I just try to say, okay, like, here's that. Then there's an argument. I actually think watching people respond, I actually think this next argument is the one they find most compelling. It's just so simple. You accept the common Catholic position that the job of the state is to promote the natural good of humanity, like temporal goodness. And then you say, well, what about the supernatural good? Because that's a weightier good. It lasts forever. It enables you to enjoy natural goods forever, like friendship or what have you. So if the state should promote the natural good, why shouldn't it promote the supernatural good? Okay, so short syllogism. The Catholic Church should promote the natural human good, or rather, political regime should promote the temporal common good. If the regime should promote the natural good, it should promote the supernatural good. Therefore, it should promote the supernatural good. And I think for the conditional statement, if the church should, or the church authorized state or what have you, should promote the natural good, it should promote the supernatural good. It's actually really defensible. And I think it's actually kind of complicated to reject it. And so I think the argument has a lot of like immediate intuitive force. Now, the problem is that the conclusion that the state should promote the supernatural good is not integralist yet. So I call it the proto-integralist conclusion. So you might think like the Eastern Orthodox way of going is better, where the monarch is the ecclesiastical leader or something like that. You might also think there's tons of arrangements that promote the supernatural good but aren't integralist at all, right? So it underdetermines regime type in a pretty big way. But if you put it together with a historical argument, they kind of clasp, because you can say, oh yeah, state should promote the supernatural good. Here's how they did it, or tried, right? And I actually think if you talk to integralists, one of those like it's dogma, and then the others are like, well, like the supernatural good, super important. Why shouldn't the state attend to it? The most fascinating thing about the discussion has been how uninterested some of them are in specifying the proper church-state relations. It's almost as if some of them think, well, maybe states could promote the supernatural good without the church. But if you follow the integralist arguments over the last 10 years, one of the things that Jesus did was to claim the good of religion for himself and the church. So the state is actually not permitted to do any promotion of the supernatural good unless the church has authorized it to do so. So you have to have that claim, right, about the church authorizing the state. And I think some people worry that I think that's just too complicated for some who really just want to promote the common good, the true common good. The state hopefully teaches the gospel or what have you. So, I just want to make clear, like, there's the defense of integralism, and I try to make it kind of strong, and then I try to kind of take problems away from it.
Thinking about the relation of integralists to historical attempts at integralism. I mean,
Yeah.
what do they think about? So, like, when we talk about, say, the state punishing heretics, I mean, what they used to do was burn them alive.
Yeah.
I guess, if you think that the state should punish heretics, or at least can in principle, like, your options maybe would be something like, well, yeah, but that was wrong at the time. They should just fine them or something. Or it might be like, yes, the church does have the right to order the state to punish, to execute heretics. Maybe it's just not advisable under our conditions. Or it could be like, yes, the church has the right to tell the state to punish heretics, and we should bring that back. Which of those? What do they think about?
So they try to be very prudential about the proper policies and punishments. So they try to remain as agnostic as possible. I do think it matters that I've read some about heresy trials. So you have to find two findings. You have to make two findings. First, that the person is actually a heretic, and second, that their heresy is contumacious, that is, it's culpable. Then the church excommunicates for a year in many cases. The person doesn't repent, and then he becomes because he's regarded as a danger to civil order, he can be punished by the state, which is why Aquinas defended the execution of heretics, because the thought is, they're extremely dangerous people. So the church burned about 150 heretics, not a huge number because there are only so many that could be shown to be contumacious, but many of them were quite influential. And they would have done it to Luther too in a heartbeat. And to Calvin, even though Calvin burned sort of anyway. So yeah, there's a couple of centuries where that is the punishment. And so you can say, well, the church was doing this for a while. Like, are you sure you can oppose this? And then I think they have to say something like that it was prudentially inadvisable, but that just leaves them wide open for the claim that was in principle permitted. And they've got to not say that. And one thing they don't want to do is follow Francis in like hardcore opposition to death penalty. If they wanted to, actually, I think you could, right? And you could also say the punishments were cruel and unusual or something like that, because being burned to death I've looked into it. It's a really horrible way to die. It's really horrible. So I don't think they're committed to like gruesome things. But if heretics are really, really dangerous, they have to do something. So there's also a reason to think heretics are more dangerous today. Even though there's a lot more diversity of opinion, you're going to try to repress some of that, right? But the communication costs are extremely low. So people who are in prison can get messages out. Like, it's not hard, right? Someone goes in, visits them, records it or whatever, right? Or relays the message by testimony, right? And also because of all this liberal pluralism around, particularly on baptized populations, there's going to be heretics, and maybe lots of them, because people have higher levels of education, and so they're more likely to be able to know what the church teaches and to disagree with it. It's also the case that if you have democracies, people have some kind of political education as well, and naturally disagree with one another, encouraged to do so. So yeah, heretics are going to lead people astray much more. So I don't see how they can get around Chinese level surveillance state tactics, which, as we discussed, is a problem for them in terms of it will apply to non-heretics. because you got to root out the heretics,
Yeah.
right? This is what China does. They have to root out the opponents of the regime, and they massively mistreat the people that aren't. So yeah, I think they have trouble resisting the more hardcore punishment. I think they can do so on prudential grounds, but I don't make the claim in the book. I just allow that they can give a principled objection. So yeah, I mean, here's something I want to say kind of in favor of them, which is it turned out that there was a lot of energy among younger Christians to think politically in theological terms. They discovered that. And I wrote the book in part because I wanted to say there are other ways to do it. And I hope that gradually a branch of analytic philosophy becomes analytic political theology. Like, I hope that comes up. And one of the things I was doing in the book that didn't realize it as I was answering a methodological question, which is, what are the tools appropriate to answer these questions? So that was one of the main things I realized was maybe interesting about the book. So they did uncover this energy somewhat accidentally, but I think that can be used towards the good.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, I think there are a number of them that do seem to be like they genuinely pious. I just think they're really mistaken about politics. And so, I mean, pious people can do bad stuff, but like, I do think a number of them genuinely do mean well. And I don't even think the more extreme, or rather, I mean, the more strategically oriented are that they relish violence or anything. I don't want to say that either, and don't want people to get that impression from the book. I mean, chapter 4, I say that's not what they want to do 7 times just to avoid that impression.
The question is just what they're committed to, at least
yes.
committed to being allowable in principle, and then what are the actual implications in terms of what we need to make this workable.
That's right. And one thing I wish I'd said, which is that, look, a lot of people in the 20th century, smart people, were hoodwinked to think that their ideology wouldn't require horrible means. Tons of people, but not just, I mean, right-wing fascists, but many, many socialists. Not your Danish or Swedish kind. I mean, like central planning. Right. A lot of smart people, ton of geniuses were like, oh yeah, this is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to be great. Einstein. I mean, and so it's not weird to say that anyone could get hoodwinked by their ideology into supporting a plan that will require violence in practice, right? I mean, there's just tens of thousands of cases of that occurring, right? So yeah, I just wanted to make clear to people listening, I'm not saying that they want to do this stuff. I'm just saying it's going to be hard for them to avoid it in practice. So yeah, that's to me really important. But again, and another thing. Another reason I wrote this book is I actually think integralism is kind of like intrinsically interesting. I think of it as like the act utilitarianism of political theologies. Like, well, what should we do? Well, the whole human good, right? And I'm glad there are act utilitarians out there. I just don't want them anywhere near power, right? But we learn a lot from saying, like, why is act utilitarianism a mistake? It's kind of robust position, right? And it's really good to work with it. Now, I feel the same way with Christians with integralism. Like, there is this kind of prima facie obviousness of it, promote the whole good, right? Promote the infinite goods just as well as the finite ones, right? Well, okay, well, what's wrong with that, right? And then I think it's useful because one thing you do is you have to articulate a ground for deontic restraints that prevent these simple trade-offs. Of course, the integralists accept that because they're not consequentialists. And they also acknowledge one constraint, which is forcing people to be baptized, right? So how is it that deontic constraint overrides infinite goodness, right? But interestingly, the integralists already accept this claim. So they don't actually make the simplest version of their argument, which is just maximize the supernatural good, right? So they still have this, deontic versus telic puzzle, but I think that's actually a pretty cool puzzle. It's hard to make it work. I think you and I, as kind of contractualists about a lot of obligations, going to argue intuitively, like, oh, well, you know, I mean, it licenses all this stuff that seems intuitively
Yeah.
wrong, and it doesn't license as much stuff that doesn't. So you have to go that route or something.
Yeah. What sort of we'll wrap this up soon, but another
Yeah.
question that popped into my head that would be helpful to get clarification on. What what sort of rights do non-Catholics have under this regime in terms of, say, like, can a Jewish person criticize Catholicism publicly, argue against it, etc.? And also, who counts as subject to coercion when you get into cases like, say, Protestants who have been baptized as Christians but not into the Catholic Church, or Eastern Orthodox people who have received, you know, they're part of the valid lineage of bishops.
Yes. Okay, so there's three groups that's worth talking about. One are the unbaptized, and there's a deep tension here in integralist thought, because there's a constitutional duty on the part of the state to protect the faithful from spiritual harm. But they also, on the modern integralist reading of Dignitatis Humanae, which is the Church's statement on religious freedom in 1965, which is that the unbaptized have a high degree, like a massive civil right of religious freedom. And that includes like building their own schools, their own publications, freedom of speech. And so then the question is, how does this integralist state perform both of those functions at the same time? And I say it's going to be tempted, if it allows too much pluralism, it's going to create instability. If it allows too little, it's going to violate the rights of the unbaptized. So I actually think it's in a real bind to balance those priorities. And the way that it tended to work out historically was that there weren't good protections from the unbaptized. You just have to look at the history of the Jewish ghettos to know that, right? Okay, so what are the other two groups? The first group are people that are baptized and culpable for, violating, certain kinds of ecclesiastical canon law or something. And those people can be subject to civil coercion after a suitable trial, and spiritual coercion coming first or something. Okay, that's not. It could be gruesome, but at least there's culpability there, right? The most interesting group are the non-culpable baptized. So, like, basically, like Pink says, like, yeah, the vast majority of the living Protestants aren't culpable, and so they can't be tried for heresy because they'd never be contumacious, they'd never be culpable. So they have de facto religious liberty. But if some reason they fell into culpability, then they could be subject to prosecution. Okay. Then the question becomes, how broadly do you think there is of what Catholics call invincible ignorance or non-culpable disagreement? Some of the integralists say, really, this is not Pink's view at all, but like Alan Phimister and Thomas Crean, I think they basically think once the gospel has been explained to someone in a way they comprehend, that they become culpable if they don't immediately convert. And Pink just totally denies this. He says, yeah, there are people that culpably deny the church's teachings, but there's a ton of people who don't. And one of the things I'm hoping to talk with him more about is where you draw the line, like how you figure out who's culpable and who isn't. In particular, what I want to know is how court figures that out. Because when we judge religious sincerity, we often just take people's word at it because it's too hard to poke around in their commitments to see what's sincere. So I think there's going to be a lot of error in both punishing the non-culpable and failing to punish the culpable. So yes, the unbaptized have extremely strong religious freedom. The culpable baptized have more limited religious freedom, and the non-culpable baptized are supposed to be protected. They're in principle subject to criminal prosecution, but they're not culpable. So, but then the interesting question is, what can the state do to the baptized non-culpable? Do they have all the same religious freedoms of the unbaptized, or can they be restricted more? And I don't have good integralist answers on this, but my view is that, the state can be a little more tough with them. Like, you can't ban the Talmud, but can you ban the proliferation of Protestant Bibles? I think that's on the table. I think that's maybe on the table, but it's hard to know. So yeah, but it is very important that they've got a dogmatic ironclad commitment to protecting the religious liberty of the unbaptized. And that does create a number of problems, because ultimately the way that quasi-integralist regimes maintained homogeneity was by punishing and limiting the unbaptized, right? That was part of the point of the Jewish ghettos in the Papal States. One of the points is to prevent them from spiritually poisoning Catholics. I've even read about cases where popes were deliberating about whether to segregate prisons between Catholics and Jews. And in fact, it was the popes that came up with the yellow clothing to mark Jews out, to keep them from being. So, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, even like what's really weird about reading about the history of the Jewish ghettos in the Papal States is how seriously the popes took their duties. Like they're getting in there like, well, you know, that would be too intolerant. Oh, well, that would allow for spiritual corruption or what have you. And, you know, there are tons of restrictions: money, lending, marriage, imprisonment, courts, conversion qualifications. So historically, the thought that religious minorities were treated horribly. Mm-hmm. And so now the interesting question is, can you have a modern integralist state that treats religious minorities extremely well, but also say like prosecutes and disciplines its members? Is that a stable arrangement, even from a practical perspective? Purely practical one, right?
Right.
So I think those are all good questions. But yeah, I think there are some really talented integralists that are really worth engaging. And I will say also this: there's a number of the American integralists that I think I wish would engage. I think they would have really interesting answers to a lot of these questions. One of the weird things about hailing from radical libertarianism as a 17-year-old, 18-year-old is that libertarians will answer every crazy hypothetical you could think of. Like, they're not going to be like, oh, well, you know, prudence will dictate different answers. They're like, no, what follows from the non-aggression principle? How does that apply to corpses? You know, I mean, so it's very, very jarring, right? To move to like the first radicals I'm talking about are like, yeah, let's entertain every bizarre case. And then the other group is like, well, we don't want to have that discussion at all. So yeah, I mean, it's been in a way less, I mean, it's been fun, but it's been kind of less fun in a way because you can't work out all the implications of the views, which you and I as philosophers just, right. That's just so much fun, right? Like it's a lot of fun. Yeah. So.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else you want to cover?
Well, I buy the book.
Yes.
It's through Oxford's discount code that you can get through my website, kevinvallier.com. You can get the book for $21. So it's pretty decent. Amazon right now is on Prime. If you have Prime, is $28. So it's pretty easy to get. If you need a review copy, email me, kevinvallier@gmail.com. I can usually get review copies from people that are committed. If you're part of a reading group and there's more than, I think, 12 people in it, we can get you a 50% discount. So anyway, that's my salesy pitch. But also just want to say very grateful to you for having me on, letting me talk about the weird stuff that I'm doing. So that's been good. But yeah, I think the book, I mean, it turned out really well, but one of the cool things is figuring out what people actually are going to say. And I think there's some promising work on this. So there'll be an American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly Symposium on the book. And I think that will be worthwhile. There'll be an Oxford conference in June. Hopefully it'll become another symposium. So there should be a lot of material out there with time.
Yeah, very good. Well, thanks a lot for coming on. And everybody should buy the book, subscribe to my channel.
Yes, subscribe.
Yes, share.
Yeah.
So thanks.